At home, I have a photo album, and in that photo album I have something that isn't exactly a photo. It's an ID card. That ID card dates back to World War I, and it was my grandfather's. My grandfather, he was born in Philadelphia, the son of Quakers, and his mother died when he was very young, and so he was raised by his stepmother. His stepmother was a strict practicing Quaker, and so he grew up as a strict Quaker. Now, if you know anything about the Quakers, they're a religious sect, but like many of the other Anabaptist groups, they're pacifists, like the Mennonites and the Amish and the Brethren, or sometimes referred to as Dunkers. They're pacifists, so they would not bear arms, they would not serve in the military. So when World War I came around, my grandfather, rather than being drafted for the war to serve in the military, the U.S. government put him to work on Hog Island there in Philadelphia, which is where they built ships. So he worked in the shipyard. And he was what is called a conscientious objector. Imagine that, a government that so respects religious conscience of a man that it will not violate it. How about that? Now imagine just the opposite. A government that elevates itself and does not respect the conscience of a man or woman. Earlier we read from the book of Daniel chapter 3, and I'll read some more verses from that. Chapter 3 and verse 3. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then they had a great gathering. They called together all the people in front of the idol. And it says, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of these musical instruments, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." Verse 6, listen. "And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the fiery furnace." Verse 8 continues. "Certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews, saying, 'There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods nor worship the image that you have set up.' The king then raged that anyone would dare defy the state. So he had them brought before them. He once again offered them the chance to worship the idol, which they did not do. And then their response. And if you get nothing else out of this sermon today, I want you to commit their response to your memory. Verse 18. "Be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." They were thrown into the fiery furnace. Now consider these two examples of religious conscience that I have put before you. In one, the state, King Nebuchadnezzar and his laws, has raised itself above men's consciences and therefore made itself above God, making of the state an idol in every way. In the other, you have a state, talking about my grandfather here, that though being run primarily by Christians who have no such scruple regarding military service, most Christians, Americans, have no trouble and have never had trouble serving in the military. But in this case, they have enough respect for one's religious convictions that they will not violate it. They will not raise themselves up above God in the religious conscience of men. In recent years, I have become very concerned about the state of religious freedom in our country. As our country becomes more secularized and less people hold any serious religious convictions, these convictions that were so prevalent among our nation's founders, we become more and more susceptible to encroachments on religious freedom. You know, nature abhors a vacuum, doesn't it? When less and less people recognize the supremacy of our Creator God in matters of conscience, the state itself will make itself a god unto them. The state becomes de facto their god. I'm deeply troubled by this. It portends great evil for us in the days ahead. And as someone who served in the military myself, to me it represents a betrayal of all the men and women who have gone before us and sacrificed for our freedoms. Another reason that it upsets me and is so hard for me to see this happening is it goes against everything I was ever taught about the founding of our country. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, so the curriculum in school gave us a heavy dose of Pennsylvania history. If you don't know much about the founding of Pennsylvania, I'll give you a brief summary. We talked about the Quakers, known as the Society of Friends. Quaker was actually meant to be a derogatory term, but like many other derogatory terms, they took it on. The Quakers suffered persecution in Europe. And then when we get to the reign of King Charles II of England, he owed money to the family of a William Penn. And so rather than paying cold hard cash, the king gave William Penn a large swath of land in the New World. But William Penn was a Quaker. And so he invited and encouraged his Quaker brothers and sisters to join him in the New World, where they could practice their religion without being persecuted. But Penn did something else. He not only invited the Quakers to Pennsylvania, guess what else he did? He invited all the persecuted groups to come. He invited the Mennonites, the Amish, the Brethren, all these persecuted groups to come to America and enjoy religious freedom, a place where the state would not exalt itself over the consciences of men, their religious consciences. Now, we don't live in Pennsylvania. We live here in North Carolina, where all my children have been born. Now, the Carolina colony, when it was set up, it did have an established state church. Okay? And the state church was the Church of England. Okay? But the first attempt to govern the colony, as far as their documents, to govern this colony, they set up religious liberty as a guarantee for the people. Supposedly the document was heavily influenced by John Locke. So even though they had a state church, there was religious liberty. And each one of the American colonies was a little bit unique. But the importance of religious liberty in these founding colonies helps us to understand the founding documents of our country, and specifically our Constitution. You see, the founders of this country saw freedom of religion to be the first freedom. Freedom of religion is the first freedom. And this is why the first right to be guaranteed in the Bill of Rights is, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Speaking of which, thinking about what I'm talking about today, is it any wonder that the IRS, the tax collector of the state, has gone after groups that want to educate people on the Constitution? Thomas Farr, he has a PhD in modern British and European history from the University of North Carolina. And this is an extended quote, but this is important. I want you to listen carefully. He says this about the founding of our country. America's founding generation identified religious freedom as the first freedom because they saw it, in effect, as a precondition for all other freedoms. James Madison wrote that each of us has rights that flow from the duty we owe God. This duty is precedent both in order of time and degree of obligation to claims of civil society. Before any man can be considered a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. Listen to this. Madison insisted if the men were to fulfill their obligation to God, they must have freedom, especially freedom from coercive powers of the state. The duty which we owe our Creator and the manner of our discharging it can be governed only by reason and conviction, not by compulsion or violence. And therefore, all men are equally entitled to the full and free exercise of it, according to the dictates of conscience, unpunished and unrestrained by the magistrate. And that was a quote of Madison. Farr continues, here then, in man's duty to the God who created him and gave him reason and will, lay man's natural right to religious freedom. In other words, performing the duty required freedom, or as Madison put it, the right of free exercise of religion. To the founders of the United States, it was necessary to the operation of other freedoms. As George Washington expressed in his final address, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are the indispensable supports. Now, Farr goes on to talk about how freedom of religion has a galvanizing effect in promoting all other freedoms. And he continues here. Why might this be the case, that freedom of religion promotes other freedom? Why is this, he says? Because any state that protects liberty, religious liberty, thereby limits itself. Religious liberty empowers religious actors both to perform services that might otherwise be carried out by the state and to adhere to an authority beyond the state. For this very reason, authoritarian governments might understandably permit some secular assembly and speech while banning or restricting religious assembly and speech. Such has been the pattern throughout history, from Stalin, Mao, Hitler, to Mexico's Calle. By the same token, empirical studies are confirming a strong relationship between religious freedom and the other freedoms that contribute to the longevity of a democracy. The work of sociologists, Grimm and Fink, for example, shows high statistical correlations between religious liberty and the presence of other fundamental freedoms that ensure the longevity of a democracy. In other words, is your democracy going to last? If it has freedom of religion, its chances of lasting are much greater. These include civil and political liberty, freedom of the press, economic freedom. Religious freedom is also highly associated with overall human development, and the violence, or the absence of violence, religious extremists. In other words, freedom of religion promotes a lack of religious violence. Advanced statistical tests suggest that there is indeed a critical, independent contribution that religious freedom is making to the other freedoms. You see, freedom of religion is not optional for a society that desires freedom. If you want freedom of the speech or freedom of the press or freedom or the right of people to peaceably assemble or to petition the government for redress of grievances, the right to bear arms, the right of people to be secure in their persons, papers, property, houses, effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. All these rights, you see, are defended and promoted by religious freedom. No society can realize these rights long without protecting the first right, and that's the right to freedom of religion. That's what the Founding Fathers said, and that's what modern history has said too. And that's what statisticians have said. I believe religious freedom is in danger in our country. So many having deliberately abandoned the notion of God, or in a practical way, we're becoming a nation that declares there is no God but Caesar. Like Babylon, the state inch by inch supplants the authority of our Creator God by violating the religious consciences of men and women. You say, how are they doing this? Well, if you read the newspaper, almost every day there's a story to this effect. What about the HHS Obamacare mandate with respect to abortion and birth control? They're forcing religious institutions like hospitals and schools to either provide abortions or close their doors. They're violating the religious consciences of men whose consciences tell them, thou shalt do no murder. And the state is saying, you must do murder. God help us. These things are still being fought out in the courts. Hobby Lobby, the store many of you are familiar with, they're still fighting this out, trying to prevent this. Seemingly day by day, there's a report of new legal or civil actions against places like Floral Shop, Bed and Breakfast, caterers, and other similar businesses who are owned by people who have convictions against gay marriage. They are forcing them by civil or legal means to either violate their conscience and make the state their God or abandon their business altogether. Almost every week you can read about that. Who would have ever thought in the Western democracies that a man couldn't get on the street and preach out of the Bible without being locked up? That's happening. Scotland, England, Canada. It's going to happen here if we're not careful. The U.S. military has, in a matter of weeks, gone from President Clinton's don't ask, don't tell policy to, in cases, persecuting GIs who have expressed that they do not believe in gay marriage. Just about a week ago, I read about an NCO with 27 years of service. He wrote a letter expressing that he did not support them using the chapel at a military facility for this, and he was forced to retire. So it's going from don't ask, don't tell to forcing people to retire who say anything about it being wrong. And unbelievably, the Supreme Court of the United States is now, as of days ago, on record for calling anyone who does not support gay marriage an enemy of the human race. People, if persecution does not follow that kind of logic, it would be a miracle. See, they're going to prosecute you for your thoughts. Lose your religious freedom, lose all your freedoms. See, they'll call you a hate criminal. You have thought crimes. You're an enemy of the human race. As the state continues to grab power, it will become increasingly difficult for someone with traditional religious convictions to hold many professions on many different types of businesses and even function in our society. For example, if a young Christian comes to me and says that they want to be a pharmacist, guess what I'm going to have to tell them? To become a pharmacist, the state has decided it is above God and it is going to demand that you participate in the killing of human beings. Because they're going to make you give out abortion medicine. You're going to become a de facto abortionist. And you don't have a choice. You say, I don't want to do that. They say, no, sorry. find another job or close your pharmacy, whatever. You can't do that. The state says no. The first right is under attack. The state is increasingly insisting that it is supreme and it is to be exalted above the consciences, the religious consciences of men in their hearts, minds, and actions. Persecution and suppression of religious freedom seems to increase day by day. Chicago's Roman Catholic Cardinal Francis said this. He said, "I expect to die in my bed. My successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square." America must wake up. Even atheists that value freedom should be afraid, because as we've seen, it has statistically been proven that all the other freedoms that we enjoy will suffer and pass away, and tyranny will reign if religious freedom is not preserved and revered. Today we're celebrating the feast of the Holy Prophet Daniel. And like his fellow Jews that we've read about, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the Holy Prophet Daniel was forced into a situation where he had to choose between his religious beliefs and the dictates of a state that exalted itself above God in the consciences of men. After the fall of Babylon to the Persians, Daniel rose to be a very high-ranking official. And a plot hatched by men jealous of him put his religious convictions on a collision course with his devoted allegiance to King Darius. Daniel chapter 6 and verse 6, I'll begin reading here. It says, "Then these high officials came to the king and said to him, 'O King Darius, live forever.' All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are all agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. So that with this document, this law, Daniel was put in a situation where he must choose between exalting the state as God and over God, or by continuing to practice his religion. Daniel's choice? Daniel continued to practice his religion. And so he continued to pray to God 3 times a day. He would not exalt the state as God. So his opponents, who hatched the whole thing to begin with, reported it to the king. The king followed his own decree and had Daniel thrown to the lions. Apart from divine intervention, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, all these men would have become martyrs, having been killed by the state that has exalted itself as God. You see, listen carefully. When the state violates the first right and exalts itself as God above your religious convictions, requiring you to do that which you cannot do, Christian, you have one reply. Listen, get it firm in your head. You may need these in the days ahead. Be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up.